Back in Melbourne. I'm an Englishman who lives in America, so it's even better to be back in Melbourne after we've just stuffed the Aussies at cricket. It doesn't happen very often, so forgive me for gloating for a few minutes while I take advantage of that. I spoke to my wife about half an hour ago, and they were just sitting down for Sunday dinner back in Ohio, and she said, please don't insult them about the cricket. And I said, it's too big an opportunity. If the roles were reversed, I'd be paying for it for 2 days. So it was pretty interesting watching the news this morning, actually. You know, I know cricket is near religious experience for most Australians, but they decided to lead with the Australian who won the Monaco Grand Prix yesterday. So I guess that was a little bit of editorial license there. It's a pleasure to be back in Melbourne. I really want to thank David, first of all, because he actually connected me with the Eventful people probably 5, 6, 7 years ago. I think he heard me speak at a SAP event back in the United States, and thought it might be entertaining to have me come out to Australia, and I think this is my 3rd visit out here, so any excuse to come to Australia is great. And particularly this time of year, I just love it. I got up yesterday morning, it was a perfect autumn day here. I went and hired a bicycle there and rode along the Yarra River for a few kilometers and had a very pleasant time doing that. Because in the last week I've been in India, Singapore, Hong Kong and Indonesia, and it was hotter than hell everywhere. So just to get some fresh air was an absolute pleasure. What I'd like to do for the next 40 minutes or so is really share with you some of the experiences. As David mentioned in the introduction, I've had either the pleasure or the pain of visiting 35 different countries in the last 15 months. It's been a fascinating journey. You know, everywhere from Santiago, and I think I'm allowed to say Sydney here, I'll say it very quietly, and Stockholm to Shanghai. And I've seen the world in very different places. It's very interesting how this global economic tsunami, whatever you want to call it, that's happened over the last 2 years has had different impact around the world. But the interesting thing for me is, you know, I first started traveling for my business back in the 1980s, spent a lot of time here in Australia and in Asia and in South America. And the conversation was different in every city. We were dealing with different circumstances, different economic situations, and different questions in terms of our maturity around performance management, around financials, around technology application in our businesses. And the conversation was different in every country. And at that time, the language was different in every country as well. It was interesting because, you know, I was in Thailand and, you know, you had to have a translator accompany you, and every meeting took an hour and a half. Last year, I was in Thailand speaking to 400 people that didn't even offer translation as an option. You know, the world has changed very dramatically in those 20 years, not just technologically, but also culturally and economically as well. For me, the most interesting part of my world tour, if you like to put it, in fact, for most of last year, I seemed to be following AC/DC around, because I actually saw them in concert 5 times in 5 different countries, which was rather cool. They played the same set every time, but they did a really nice job. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Anyway, the interesting thing was, we were having the same conversations in Shanghai as in San Francisco, as in Seattle as in Sydney. We're all in the same place. You know, we've got different local economic circumstances. The economy here in Australia is doing relatively better than economies in many of the other countries I've had the opportunity to visit. But when we talk about best practices, when we talk about technology, when we talk about managing uncertainty, we're all dealing with the same issues. The speed with which knowledge flows around the globe today is unprecedented. But also the speed with which what seem to be minor economic or political or cultural or social events in one part of the world ripple through the rest of the world is fascinating. You know, who would have thought 3 years ago that overinflated house prices in Las Vegas and Phoenix, Arizona would have an impact on the Australian economy, the Chinese economy, the Indian economy, the Ukrainian economy? You know, when I started my tour in March of last year, I'd never heard of the H1N1 virus. 4 weeks later, I was not allowed to get off the airplane in Shanghai until they'd taken my photograph and my temperature. The speed with which a minor flu outbreak in northern Mexico became a global pandemic was lightning speed. Now, when I was a kid growing up in England in the 1970s, those types of events would have been an interesting item on the 6 o'clock news on the BBC. It would not have been a business issue for someone turning up in their office the next morning. What about terrorist bombs going off in Mumbai in December of 2008? Or what about the whole of Europe being closed for 2 weeks because of volcanic ash coming from Iceland? Again, these would have been news stories. They would have not been business issues. But if you think about the environment that we live in today, the implications, I mean, who thought the Greek economy would have an impact? 20 years ago, we wouldn't really have cared about it. You know, we may have felt sorry for the people who were impacted on the news. You know, I was supposed to do a speech in Bangkok next week. I'm not going, for obvious reasons. These are real issues. Maybe you have outsourced IT operations in India. Maybe you have manufacturing facilities in Mexico. You know, they closed down Mexico for 1 week last year because of the virus to try and stop the spread. These are issues we have to deal with. And it's fundamentally changing the way we think about finance and the way we think about using technology to support our financial operations to help make better business decisions.